Greetings and welcome back to our tutorial on the Generate Client Security Hash. We are now ready to embark on building our dispatcher bot for this project. So up until this point, we've gotten very consistent with using the new project as a process option. We are now ready to shift gears a bit, and underneath our options here for template, we want to go into the option here for Robotic Enterprise Framework, or more commonly known as the RE framework. So go ahead and click here. And as you do this, you'll notice it brings us to the same type of dialog box that we're accustomed to before. In this case, we want to go ahead and call this one our hash. I'm going to call this hash bot. And in this case, let's call this one dispatcher. Wherever you're saving your projects, go ahead and be consistent that way. And recall with the requirements that we have discussed in the previous video, this is a project in which we need to identify WI work item, anyways, WI5 work item 5 records that are in open status, and subsequently load those records to the queue. That's exactly what this bot is going to be responsible for doing. So our dispatcher bot is going to identify the WI5 records that are in open status, and then subsequently take those records and load them into the queue, specifically the work item ID. If you want to be more specific. Not required. Again, meaningful description as to what this particular project does. So hashbot dispatcher, go ahead and make sure your path is set right, and then a brief description as it pertains to what this project is going to do. And obviously the opposite of this, when we get to our performer bot in the next video, is going to be responsible for taking those WI5 records that are in open status out, and then subsequently generating the hash values and updating the record accordingly based on what we had talked about in the previous video. So at this point, go ahead and click Create. It's going to go through the same type of process that we have used before, in the sense it's building all the projects, it's bringing all the dependencies in, all the activities that are going to be needed to build our project, at least in the initial state. It's all being gathered and put together for us at this point. You're going to notice when we go over to the project tab, though, from what we have seen previously, there are a handful of new folders here. Again, the data folder containing our config file that we've talked about before, and then the framework folder containing all of the files that are part of the overall RE framework. The template, exactly what has been built by UiPath as part of the overall template that we are going to be able to incorporate all of our project requirements, in this case for Generate Client Security Hash. So collapse that down. We are going to come back to config here momentarily, but for now, go ahead and open up the main workflow. Again, it could be from the link here, or you could double click the main.xaml file in the project tab. Both are going to lead you to the same final destination, which would be right here. And recall in our previous discussion, we have specifically mentioned this get transaction data state is responsible for getting information out of the orchestrator queue. Recall we are doing a dispatcher bot here. We are putting information into the queue, so we are actually going to remove or delete the state from our project since we are not getting information from the queue. But before we do that, one thing I always have alluded to in the past already is to clean this little mess up here. Simply click on success, grab the little fill handle, expand this out so we have a little bit more room to see exactly what it is we're trying to do. But in particular here, we need to get rid of this state. We're not going to get data from the queue. So we have to move some of our arrows around here, some of our transition states, as they're specifically called. Move them from one state to another. In this case, a successful state normally, as part of RE framework, we go and get a transaction out of the queue, get the next transaction item out of the queue. In this case, though, we don't want to do that. So I want to click on the successful transition, exactly where it goes into the get transaction data. You'll notice there's a little blue fill handle, option here. I want to click on it and drag it down to process transaction state and let go. So you'll notice successful is now down here. This is starting to get ugly. We will clean this up in just a moment. The other one that we want to call out is the process transaction state. On the success transition going to get another transaction, we're not going to go get more data. We're going to be loading data. So take the success here. Same idea. I clicked on success transition where it goes into get transaction data. Simply click on the little fill handle icon here as it goes into the get transaction data state. Click it. Looks like I missed my click. Yes, I did. So no, I didn't. I had it right. If you ever mess it up, Control Z puts it right back to where it was. So I want to go back to here, click and drag again. In this case, move success over to the end of process state. Once we're done getting our records loaded into the queue, that's where this logic for getting the record or putting the records into the queue is going to be. We simply want to end our process at that point. You'll notice the only other transition coming in is on a business rule exception going in to get more transaction data. We're not going to have any logic or business rule exceptions as part of this automation or dispatcher bot. So I'm not going to be too worried about this. If we have any issues, we're going to be throwing an application type level exception here and aborting our process or trying to go through a retry, reconnect to the application and start fresh. So business exception, we're not going to worry about moving this one, but you'll notice when we delete this state, this transition will also be deleted. Anything coming in gets deleted by default. So to get rid of this get transaction data state, simply do a right click here and say delete, and you'll notice the business rule exception again went with it. We're at a point now we can do a little bit of housekeeping, a little cleanup, if you will. It's not required. If we ran our automation right now, it would run successful. But at this rate, just to make things a bit neat and tidier, I want to move the system exception over, expand that a little bit. The successful state here, since it's going on the side now, let's bring it in the top there. Maybe bump this one over a little bit just so it's not totally tied into the system exception. And obviously the success one here, just moving it over. Again, what I'm doing right here is not necessarily required. It just makes things easier to see. Notice what I've done here. Got everything in a much easier to read and viewable diagram here. And notice to this point, the only changes we've made to right now is deleting the one state and moving some of our transitions around, arrows, and moving them from one to the next. I'm actually going to run my bot right now, debug current file. If I hit the play button here on the main, you'll notice the bot will run successfully, and we have not actually coded anything. What you'll see here in our output window is we have killing processes, opening applications, transition successful, and closing applications. This actually turns into a really awesome checklist that we can use to ensure that we meet all of the processing needs as it pertains to the overall RE framework. And again, in a bit of a review from our previous conversation, remember in the initialization state, we want to turn on systems that need to be automated. Whatever system we're going to automate against, make sure those systems are logged in and, first opened up and then obviously logged in to where we can begin processing whatever needs to be processed within that system or systems. And then obviously on the converse side, being able to end those processes on the other side. So that's why I use this as kind of a checklist. It's going to walk us through all the tasks that we need to complete in order to ensure automation is successfully up and running. So first things first, we know the expectations for this assignment. If you haven't already opened it up, we've got the Acme System 1 web page. We're going to use Internet Explorer in this case. That's more the default browser that UiPath prefers. It's obviously not required, but the interconnectivity of .NET as it pertains to Studio, IE is always going to be your browser of choice if at all possible. Obviously, not all websites behave nicely in IE, and you're forced to use other browsers, so that is definitely understood. But along those lines, we're trying to demonstrate the only thing that our particular automation here and now, the only program it's going to use is Internet Explorer. We're going to log into the Acme 1 web page, identify all those WI5 records, load them to the queue, and then subsequently log out. That's the only thing that this particular task, in our dispatcher bot is responsible for doing. So with that said, going back to the checklist idea here, killing processes before we begin processing any work inside of any automation, we want to make sure all the applications that we are using are no longer running before we begin turning things back on. So using this checklist here, killing processes is the first thing we need to make sure that we do. And in order to do that, if we go into the initialization state, and there's a couple ways of doing this. I want to walk you through the detail view so you know exactly where this is at inside of the overall RE framework. This killing all processes is a task. Really, it's a process or a XAML file that lives inside of the initialization state. So double click on here. This one can be a bit tricky to find. It's actually contained inside this if first run read local configuration file. And if you expand out the first run here and scroll down, you'll notice there is the invoke kill all processes workflow. And it's going to kill all the Windows processes representing applications used in the overall process here. This is found inside. So if I hit open workflow here, notice it's part of the framework, kill all processes, which implies under project I could go in framework and also double click on kill all processes here. This and opening workflow here accomplish the same end result. Again, this is found under if orchestrator queue name not specified underneath first run. So you have to expand these out. Right underneath there is the invoke kill all workflow. So go ahead and open this workflow. When you do this log message here, killing processes, that's the exact message you see in the output window down below. So this is always going to be one of the first things that you want to do. Identify the processes, what programs are going to be open when your automation is running, and you want to make sure that they are first turned off. They're not running. You want the system to be in a pristine state before we begin actually automating our process. So what we need to do here inside of kill all processes, again, kind of looking at it from a checklist point of view, go back to our activities tab and type in kill process. If you bring in kill process, you'll notice a little blue dot shows up. It says that we're missing values here. Arguments aren't configured. It's what we've ultimately needed to do is on this process name, not process, but specifically process name, specify the name of the process that needs to be closed. And if I, in this case, type in iExplorer, in quotes, this is talking about Internet Explorer. Notice there is no R. It doesn't say Internet Explorer, it's just simply iExplorer. The way you're able to reference these values is if you go into Windows Task Manager and specifically look at the details. I'm going to pull this up on the right monitor here. You'll notice when I scroll down and look for Internet Explorer, you'll notice there is an iExplorer.exe. This is the Internet Explorer web browser. We want to kill that task. What this kill task activities doing simply in concept, conceptually here, it's going to click on each of these activities and hit the end task and cause the browser or that program to cease to be running any longer. To this point, kill all processes, go ahead and hit save, but that's where that name comes from inside of the task manager. Kind of went a bit quick on that. Let me pull the details back up so you can see. We're talking the name. Again, iExplore right here. So that iExplore, notice that there is no .exe. That's exactly the value here. Again, make sure it's in process name. That will always ensure Internet Explorer is closed before we begin automating any of our work. So I'm going to close the kill all processes. Everything's done there. Go ahead and save your work if you have not done so already. If I scroll down, note I'm still inside of the initialization state. If I scroll down just a bit further, I want to run into the next important XAML file, in this case, the init all applications. So notice, again, part of the framework. I'm going to use my little checklist below from my output window from when I just ran a moment ago. You'll notice it says opening applications. It's this XAML file in which we will put all of the logic we need to successfully log into all of the systems or environments that are needed to be, ultimately automated against. What applications must we use in order to identify work? In this case of the dispatcher bot, performer bot, what systems need to be accessed in order to actually do, the procedural work that needs to be subsequently automated. So init all applications, again, it's part of the framework, so that implies I could also go to the projects tab here and double click and open the init all applications here inside the framework folder, or I can simply say open workflow. Both accomplish the same end result. It will open us up into the init all applications tab here. You'll notice opening applications is the log message found, and that's exactly what we see in the output window here. This becomes the next major part of code that, or I should say the next major component that we need to be able to provide some solutions for as it pertains to, in this case, opening applications. What do we need to do to actually get the process started? What programs need to be opened up? In this case, we only have a single one. In this case, it's getting logged into the System 1 web page, obviously more specifically through the use of Internet Explorer. This is actually going to be the first time we create a new XAML file. This is a very explicit task and very specific task for the work it is that we need to be able to do. So first things first, before we go creating new XAML files, it's customary to go ahead and create a new folder. And these new folders that we'll create, this one's going to be a bit generic, that we only have a single folder for the System 1 web page. Come our performer bot next, we're going to have the System 1 web page, but then recall we're going to have that SHA-1 web page. So we'll actually have a folder for each. Basically, you create a folder per each application and group your XAML files based on a per application basis. It's a customary common tradition standard to use in part of your development. So in this case, do a right click. I'm doing a right click down here below, main process. I'm simply saying add a new folder. And I want to call this one System 1. All the XAML files that will live in here are going to be specific to the Acme System 1 web page. Much to the lightness, Framework has its own folder. These are all the files that are used exclusively for the RE framework. So this is where we begin to build our first XAML file. Notice I'm inside of the init all applications, ready to go. This is where my new XAML file is going to exist, right underneath opening applications. We're going to open up the Acme System 1 web page. So in order to do that, let's add a new sequence. So right clicking on the System 1 folder we just created, scroll down to add, and then click sequence. In this case, I'm going to prefix my file name of System1 underscore. And in this case, being very specific, what does this thing do? What does this XAML file do? What does this new sequence do? It's going to log us into the System1 web page. You'll notice the location here is already set on System1 because that's where I did my right click from. So typically, customarily, I will not need to ever change the location if I use that same approach each and every time. So no change to location, but give it the meaningful name System1 login and click create. This again is one of my small little personal peeves as to how Studio behaves. You'll notice it immediately brings us into the System 1 login XAML file as a nice clean blank file, which obviously we're going to get into here momentarily. But I always say right here, go back to where it is you want that new XAML file invoked. Where do you want to ensure that that file gets executed from? Because we could build a nice, pretty XAML file here that does exactly what it is we want it to do. But if we never actually invoke the code, actually cause the code to be executed, it's worth no cause that we built a new fully functional XAML file if we don't actually execute it. So I try to get in the habit whenever I do create a new XAML file to always come back to the file that I want the file invoked in or from. In this case, the System 1 is my new one. And go ahead and invoke this file, drag it across. In this case, you'll notice everything's happy. Simply hit save here, save all of our work, make sure we got our file invoked. Open Workflow is going to take us to here. We're ready to begin building our new XAML file. So the first thing we need to do is actually cause Internet Explorer to open up and then navigate to the Acme System 1 web page. I want to kind of take you down a path here for a minute just so you can see kind of a visual of what it looks like, then explain a concept, fix what that problem is, walk us through how to fix that particular issue, and then take us through how to resolve that and then continue moving forward. The activity that you need here is called Open Browser. Make sure I get rid of my old activity there. I want to bring in a Open Browser activity here. So mind you, I'm in System 1 login now. I'm getting ready to build my first XAML file. I want to open up the web browser. You can notice here it says Open Browser. What URL do you want to navigate to? In this case, I want to navigate to the UiPath Acme web page. So if I copy the URL here, minus I'm not going to grab the login that's automatically populated. We don't have to do that. This is where that value would normally be found. But again, this isn't technically correct. I want to make a tweak here in a minute. I want to just start with a basic demonstration as to how this works. So pasting in this what we call a hard-coded value. I want to make sure the browser type is set to Internet Explorer. So in my properties window, a quick little change here. Set your browser type. In this case, we're going to work in IE. If you were doing any other browsers, this is where you would ensure the right browser opens up. In this case, we want to use Internet Explorer. Recall we had the kill activity in here a minute ago. I'm going ahead and hit save here. I want to go back to main, and the reason I mentioned that kill activity, I want to actually hit the debug file and have it execute the whole automation. Notice all we've done is we've added a kill activity. We should see IE since I have mine open. I should see it close, and then I should see it open right back up based on that new open browser activity that we put in just a second ago. So from main, go ahead and hit play. And as you guys do the same, see if your web browser closes. And it looks like mine did right there. Now I should see it reopen and take me to the Acme web page. And there it is. Notice the login shows up by default. Execution was successful. Here I am back on the Acme web page. So our logic to this point is indeed successfully working. However, this right here is not correct logic. We don't want to get in the practice of hard coding values. This is where this notion of the config file, which is in our project tab here under data, here it is, config. This is where we want values like these to reside. The main reason why you don't want to hard code a value here is, let's say, we deploy this automation to a production environment. If we need to make changes, heaven forbid the UiPath web page decides they're going to rename it, just acme.uipath.com and no longer acmetest.uipath.com. They made that change, our automation would fail immediately because that URL would no longer be valid. And if we hard code the value here, this is where we'd actually have to go back in and make the necessary code change right here to update the URL to the new correct path. By specifying this value in the config, we're actually simply able to make the update inside the config file and have that value automatically replicate through without the need of making any type of code change. So depending on your organization, obviously there's various ways this may be done, but if you have an actual change release type process, you may have a code change here that impacts the need to redeploy that code back into production, as opposed to simply making a simple update in the config file. So how do we get this value into the config becomes the next important question. So if we open up the config, recall the configuration, it's really nothing more than a dictionary variable inside of our automation. We need to go to the settings tab over here. There's actually a couple things we need to consider in here. The first one, I want to take advantage of this little blank row here. I want my key to be system1_URL, and the value then becomes this value right here. So if I paste in the value, make sure you do not have the double quotes though. This needs to just be the actual value itself, Acme UiPath, acme-test.uipath.com. It's helpful to put a meaningful description in here as well. So URL, and I say primary or home base URL for Acme system website. Just kind of a meaningful description of what that URL is all about. With this particular key value pair. Remember, this is the config. If you want to get this value out, this is the key that you need to use in your config file or config dictionary to get this value back out. So the other one that I wanted to change, since we're here, notice there's a value for orchestrator queue name. Recall we are going to be going here eventually. If you forgot the name of the queue name, I want to quickly navigate to cloud.uipath.com. So I'm kind of digressing here for just a moment, just so we can see this update in action here. Since we're in orchestrator, or since we're in the config, let's go ahead and make the update to that queue name. And recall the queue name here, once we get logged into Cloud's UiPath web page, right here for orchestrator services, so actually referencing the orchestrator itself. You'll notice there is the option here to go into queues. There's our queue name right here, in this case being Acme 1. So if I copy this and paste this value back into the config, this needs to be the queue name that we're going to use for our particular project here. So there's where the Acme 1 value comes in. So I'm going to hit save on this. I don't need the config anymore, but I do need this value here, or will need this value here. So system1_URL. Just want to copy that on my clipboard. Go ahead and close my config. I do want to save it. I want to save my update there. Bounce back to Studio. Here's the first major dilemma that we have here, and this is some of the work that we'll have to get accustomed to doing. You'll notice inside my file here, I have no reference to the config. I don't have any way of populating that value right here. So that means I need to go back and look at init applications and keep my fingers crossed that inside here config exists, and guess what it does. So in init applications, notice it's an argument inside of init applications. This is implying, if we go a step further just so you can see all the dots get connected, if we go back to main, recall inside our variables we have config. There's the value that gets loaded from the spreadsheet. It gets loaded, string and object here. So in this case, our URL value is going to return back the actual URL itself inside config. This is inside main. We have to get this value all the way over to system1 login, our new XAML file that we just created. And in order to do this, you'll notice in init applications, just so you can visually see it, you'll see the arguments. It takes config from main, sends that config in direction-wise, talking right to left here, the in direction here, putting it into the in config. This in config here lives inside of init applications. So that's how the config makes it into init applications. So now that we're here, that's where the value of in config comes into play. This implies here with System 1 login, and there's kind of two camps to this. A lot of people say just pass config all the way through, have it available inside of here. But the problem there is anytime we deal with any type of reusability, we want this to be a bit more generic. So what I always recommend here inside of our arguments is that we create a new argument here simply called in underscore, say system 1 URL. What is the URL that needs to go in this box? It needs to be inbound, so taking it from init all applications in this case, sending it into the login file here, or the login XAML file, a parameter or argument called in, so it's inbound system1 URL as type string. And if I do that, you'll notice I now have the ability to type in the in underscore system1 URL parameter. Notice all my errors are gone now. If I hit save here though, notice I created a new argument. I need to connect the argument with the file or the XAML file that's calling system1 URL, which is in init all applications. You notice this is highlighted explicitly from our orange text here saying, we don't have everything connected correctly. So if I hit the import arguments here, this is where we finally specify our in config. In config, remember this is our key. Notice this key is string. Or call the value from our config file. I put this on my clipboard, system1 underscore URL. This is the key inside of the config file. Close the quote, parenthesis. Since it comes to us as an object, recall we're sending this as string. I have to use the typecast here, taking it from an object. Notice here as I hover over in config, it's saying as an object. I have to convert it to a string. So now I'm taking the value, it's actually in the spreadsheet, the actual website URL, and sending that value into our new argument in system1 URL. So if I save here, and again, purely from a demonstration perspective, and go back to main, and go ahead and hit debug here, we should see with our config, if you have config open, make sure it's closed before you run, otherwise you're going to get an error. Simply close the file and tell it to retry. You notice the web browser has successfully opened. I know my automation at this point is good. Hopefully everybody else is coming along nicely as well. Go ahead and leave the login here up and running so where we can actually see the UI, because now we're ready to actually start interfacing with it. We need to be able to get some data loaded, obviously in this case the email and password. One item to note here, where are these values at? We've got one more critical activity that we have to bring in before we're able to manipulate any of this data. Recall this information is contained inside of our orchestrator again. And since I had that kill browser, I need to go back to here. Open up the website. It looks like it still has me logged in, which is good. Simply go back to Orchestrator Services. And what I'm going after here is the assets. We need to be able to retrieve the username and password from this particular asset. So I'm going to copy my Acme One login name here, the asset here. This is what's going to allow me to get the value back. So in order to do this, we go back into here. There is an activity first that we need to look at called, and I do this all the time on the projects tab, I need to go on the activities tab. Go over to the activities tab here and bring in a new activity called get credential. It's right here. I want to bring this above my open browser activity. You'll notice in here, if I hover over here, it's actually going to say gets a specified credential by using a provided asset name and returns username and secure password. That's what's going to allow us to reference this value here, and it's going to get the username and password back out for us on this side. That's what this little activity does. But again, it needs to know what the asset name is. And we don't want this to be a hard-coded value either. So this tells us we need to go back to our config file. So project tab data, open up your config file again. And inside of here, the order of these does not matter as long as the order from left to right, the key and the value are correct. So in this case, let's do another one here, system1 underscore credential. In this case, I want to paste the value in from Orchestrator. Acne1 login. Now simply state gets the username and password from Orchestrator for system1 website. Then simply save your file here. This is the new value that we want to save, and in much to the same logic that we just went through a moment ago, we need to be able to pass this value into our new XAML file and be able to send that data on. I'm going to close my config here after I save this to my clipboard, our key, so I can get this value asset name back. So if I close this, yes, save. I need a new argument here. In this case, I want to call this one in underscore credential. It's going to be of a in value. I want to send that data in as a string. So we're good there. This in credential up here, our new get credential, I mean, you'll know that right here, input asset name. What is the asset name? And again, that's talking about the value directly out of Orchestrator. Again, what's this name here? And that's what we just loaded into our config file. So with our new parameter that we have, we want to specify in credential here. If I hit save and go back, you'll notice it's going to be complaining I've got another unlinked argument here, and that's with the new one here for in credential. So back here in All Applications, if I open this one up, we use the same syntax above. In config, open parentheses, say system1 credential dot toString. And now we successfully have loaded the asset name that we have in the config, place it into in credential right here. So hit save here. Notice All Applications is happy, the arguments are happy. I can go back to system1 login. There's two more values that I need to look at from the output side. You'll notice one comes back as a secure string of password, and the other one comes back to me as a type of string. Since these are coming to me, I need to be able to catch them. I need to be able to hold these values for future processing. That always implies I need to create a new variable if one is not already created. You'll notice I have no variables yet. So to keep this simple and easy, come over and get credential here for password, do a Control-K. I'm going to simply call this one password and hit enter. You'll notice as soon as I hit enter, it puts the password name here for my variable as a secure string. It's telling me it's encrypted. I can't actually see the password coming back from Orchestrator. On the other side, another Control-K here for user name. And hit enter here. Same thing, new variable of username, in this case type string. I'll actually be able to see the individual username at this point, which is cool. If I hit save here, just to make sure everything's good to go, I want to go ahead and close. Well, you know what? I don't need to close. It's automatically going to close when I run. Let's see if we're getting username and password back. So what I'm going to do here is simply do let's go ahead and do log messages here. Log message, I'm going to bring two of them in just so we can see if the logic is working as we desire. I want to make both these informational. I want to simply say username is, and type in username. Same thing on the other side. doing this mainly just for your demonstration. Obviously, we just said we won't be able to see it. Just to prove the point, username is password. Notice it's secure string. It's arguing that it's of type string, can't convert. So let's typecast it to say make that a string. Everything's happy here. If I save, go back to my main tab and hit debug, you should see the browser close. You should see the system at least pull back, log itself back in where the page loads. And it does. Automation should end. But in my output window, I should now have, here's my username, and then notice password. It's just secure string, so it's not going to actually let us see the value, but you notice we receive no errors. Everything appears to be working as designed and expected. So going back to System 1 login now, there's one more activity that I just realized I had failed to include. I want to bring in a maximize window activity, place it at the top of the do. This is going to ensure that the web browser is opened up in a maximized window state. Really just trying to ensure consistency for the automation, that it's hitting the right spots on the screen, consistently on a desired basis. So it's always good practice to make sure your windows are always in a maximized state before you begin automating anything. So right here, we are ready to actually begin typing into our fields. So the first thing we need to do is bring in a type into activity. Notice keyboard type into. Let's bring this in right underneath the username. So we know we're going to type in the username. Let's type into where on our interface do we want to actually begin typing into. So I'm going to click on indicate on browser, make sure your IE window is still open and it's logged into the, or not logged into, but it opened up to the login screen for the Acme One web page. In this case, hit indicate element inside browser. In this case, my browser was right underneath, so it immediately takes me into where I can click on the email box to continue working here. First thing I want to do is look at my selector. And this, for some reason, happens all the time on this open browser on the Acme One web page. You simply have to hit this indicate element again. And you may have to do an F2, which allows you to pull the web browser back to the foreground. In this case, I did not, so simply click on the email box again. You'll notice you get a validated browser. In this case, the selector looks really good. I don't have any concerns here. Go ahead and click OK. On my target over here on the right, I want to set my property here for wait for ready to complete. Make sure the web page is loaded before we begin attempting to type any text. It's always a good practice to empty the field to make sure there's no other text or values in the box before we begin typing any values. And obviously the value that we want to type in right here, you could type it in this box here, or underneath our input target text, you could type it in right here. In this case, this becomes our user name. Notice everything's happy there. The next one we need to be able to do is we can't use a type into for the password, and the reason being is it has the secure text property set. So there is actually a secure text right here, type secure text. I want to bring this right underneath the password here. So indicate element inside browser, we're going to have to repeat the same type of process we did just a moment ago. So clicking on the secure text on the password box. Look at your selector, you're probably going to run into the same issue again. And sure enough, indicate element again. Again, you might have to do an F2 to bring the browser to the foreground. Do a password here. Everything's good. The selector looks great. No major concerns there. So I'm going to go ahead and OK here. Set your wait for ready property to complete. Don't start typing in the box until the web page has been fully loaded. And again, make sure the field, since it's a type into, is blank. We don't have any password data, waiting. Notice the one difference here, that the secure text doesn't have the same type of box that we saw a moment ago with the username being able to place it here. This actually shows up in the input window up here in secure text. This is where we would specify our new variable for password. And if we hit save here, Now we've got it to where the username and password should be typed in. Go ahead and run your automation here just to see if the UI oops, and I did not do that where I wanted to. I want to stop here. Make sure you do this from main. I want to actually have it load all the way in like we would normally see the bot run. So go back to main tab, hit play, debug. I always say play because it looks like a play button. Go ahead and hit play here, debug your file. IE should close, IE should reopen because of the kill activity. Now you should actually see it type in the username and password. The reason that I have done this is I want to be able to demonstrate an important concept here. We've got the ability to simply bring in a click activity and actually click on the login button. One of the best practices you'll ever want to get into inside of doing automation inside UiPath is to take advantage of being able to send what's known as hotkeys. Hotkeys are control characters, alt type characters, the different key combinations. Being able to send keystrokes to the browser rather than actually trying to do mouse activities such as click. The issue that's going to come into play here is the way the secure text interfaces. Here we've got an interesting situation sitting on our hands. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is we could obviously bring a click activity in. It would work right underneath after we type in the secure text. On the other side, notice real closely inside of the input email here, there's this type into and there's a special keys option here, and one of these just happens to be the enter key. And if I do this, what this says is types in the username and press enter. But notice the order of these two is backwards. If I typed in the username and hit enter, I want to get an error saying no password specified. Us as humans, we're always accustomed to typing in the username and then the password next. What I highly suggest that we do here is actually reverse the way the password and username is typed in. From a bot, it doesn't care, but being able to take advantage of a keystroke like this becomes extremely important. We need the password to be there before the username is typed in and then enter subsequently pressed. So an easy way to do this, I want to grab the two log messages here. I want to do a right click and say cut, and come up to the top and simply say paste. I move those two around. The password gets typed in first now, and then the username gets typed in, and then the enter key is pressed as soon as the username is done. And that again was done by doing the little plus out here on the end. Notice that the plus here, you can put a space here if you want. If it makes it a bit easier to see, that's fine. It's not required, which cleans it up a little bit more. There is an activity out here called send hotkeys. We could have, as an alternative to the press enter, we could have brought this activity in, left the sequence of these the same, and simply press the enter button this way. This would have accomplished the same end result right here. We could have done this, but why bring an extra activity in if we've got the capability of doing this? Notice the keys that you see in this list just happen to be the same ones that appear in the list here. So eliminating the need for an extra activity. So brought this in for demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. It is not needed since we're doing that capability right here. So go ahead and hit save there. Go back to main and see if your bot actually successfully logs in this time. We're pulling the web page back up. Notice the password's typed first, then the username. It hits enter, and it should successfully log you into your Acme One page. And mine, in this particular case, did. So going back to the Acme One web page. It's probably not a bad idea here to actually check to see if we were successfully logged in to the web page or not. So let's bring in another log message. Again, the log messages, it's really the eyes that we're able as the human user to see what the bot's actually doing. So if we were running the server side, in an unattended type situation, these log messages become imperative so we know exactly what's going on step by step as the bot is executing. In this case, we're just going to say confirming successful login is an informational message. And in order to do this, there is a element exists activity out here. Element exists. I'm going to bring this activity in, place it in underneath our log message. And notice it's very similar to what we've done to this point. Make sure you're still on your Acme page on the home screen here. And in this case, I want to tell it to look at this screen right here. Welcome your email address to System 1. And click here. Our selector is going to be the same issue. Do the indicate element again. If you have to do the F2 to bring the browser to the foreground, please do. If not, if it's right there, you should be good. I want to make sure this selector is very specific to our needs. Notice this is not necessarily the best selector here. What I want to do here is actually go into UI Explorer and see if we can make this selector just a bit more specific than what it currently is right now. It's open on my other monitor, bring it over. What I want to do is actually hone in on, notice in the AA name here, and also intertext, in this case, either one would work. But again, AA name is kind of the preferred one. CSS we don't need in this case. This becomes a bit more of a more sophisticated but very specific selector. Are we actually logged in as the desired user here? So what I'm going to suggest we do is change the selector to look just like this. I brought in AA name, remove CSS selector. If I do a validate here, everything looks good. If I highlight it, you'll see it's still on the exact spot that we desire. Go ahead and hit save here. If I go back to here, you'll see our new selector at this point, and it's happy. Notice though, this value here is very specific to our current user. What if all of a sudden we change user accounts? You know, making sure that the user account always matches. This is where we can use a dynamic selector here. So recall the open curly brackets, there's 2 of them. Remember, we have a username. That's all that value is. It's the username, the email account for the website, followed by 2 closed curly brackets. If I validate right here, you'll notice it's in error. We'll come and fix this here in just a second. Go ahead and hit OK here. If I go back to my variables tab, the username, type in your email address, whatever email address is currently loaded right here. I want to copy it so I know it's exact. Obviously don't need that extra space. But right to our username field, in the default values, paste in the email address. I got rid of that extra space again. So variables tab, username, paste in the email account, the actual username for the website. Say edit selector, and you'll notice now with that dynamic selector, it's pulled in the email address here from the default. Just popped it in here. Our selector is happy. So we know we've got a good selector here. It's going to make sure that this will work for any account that's used when we log in our bot. So element exists, make sure you set this one to wait for ready, make sure that the page is loaded before we go checking for the value. And then the other thing here, we want to set a exists here, say Control K, Boolean, that's B-O-O-L, bool logged in. Are we successfully logged in, yes or no? Are we logged in, yes or no? So that's what this is talking about here. Notice the type here exists talking about Boolean. Are we successfully logged in? Is this value on the screen? Yes, true, or no, it is not. So obviously we need to then check those values. So I bring in an if activity, place this underneath the element exists. Simply in the condition say, are we logged in? B-O-O-L, are we logged in, yes or no? If we are, great. Everything's running exactly as planned and desired. So informational message, simply say here, system 1 website successful login, something along those lines. On the other side, though, this is where we actually would want to throw our first error. In order to do that, bring in a throw activity. In this throw, recall the exception. I'll pull this up into a bigger box just so you can see it a little cleaner. Say new. In this case, we're working with application exceptions. Simply say unable to log into Acme One web page. Unable to log in to Acme One, say website. For some reason that didn't show up on the screen. We attempted to log in. We've got a problem here. We can't automate the rest of our process because we couldn't actually get authenticated or logged into the Acme One web page. So go ahead and hit save here. And this is a point that creates a lot of confusion for people as well. This throw, if we raise an error here, you'll notice this particular workflow XAML file is not in a try catch, but it is. It's just not readily apparent here. So if we throw an error here, it's going to cause it to go back to init all applications. Notice there is no try catch block here either, but there is. If we go all the way back to main, notice that's where the init all application was invoked. If I scroll up, you'll see that this actually lives inside of a try catch, so that unable to log in error would be caught down here. If I go to the bottom, notice exception, there's the system exception we were talking about. Notice system exception raises an error. If I go back to main just so you can see it, recall we're still inside of init, we're logging into the web page. Notice system exception here. If system exception is not nothing, that's where we abort the process. We can't get logged in the web page. We can't automate the work down here in process transaction if we can't get logged in the web page. So that's how that throw process works. So again, back to System One login. This file is complete. We should have everything to where we could truly see that we are successfully logged in. So one thing before we rerun and test our automation here, go ahead and hit the log out button. Otherwise it will keep us logged in. So I'm going to log out of the Acme One web page. I'm not going to be too worried about closing the browser because again, and in our kill process, it will close it, go back to main, hit play, hit debug. Let's see what we get. We should see the browser get closed. Mine just did. We should see it reopen. Type in the password first. I know it's backwards, but we're leveraging that enter on the email. It logs ourselves in. The bot should cease executing because we haven't told it to do anything further. So our login logic appears to be successful. So confirming successful login is done. There's our logic here. Transaction successful. The reason it is we haven't told it to do anything yet. But this is a stage in development where I always say if we turn on an application, we log into an application, let's log out of it and close. So taking care of the end process state. So down here on the very end, taking care of the closing application states. So we're successfully logging in. That XAML file is done. We are done with this. I'm going to close the login. We're done. We've opened up all the applications for what the dispatcher bot requires. So that's done. Check. Let's now look at closing down that process. So going into end process, you'll notice inside here there's a try catch block. I'll expand the try. Right up front, you'll see framework close all applications. So again, kind of two ways you can get here. Project tab, notice framework folder, so I expanded it out. There's close all applications. You could double click here, or you can do the open workflow here. So again, so you can just see it, we're back on main. This is where I always talk about if we open up an application or applications, before we even start building the process, make sure we clean up our process. So we open up an application, come into the end process and close that very application back down. That's why I'm jumping here to end process state. So when you open it up, again, on the try side here of end process, there's close all applications. If I open that workflow, again, either here, or you can double click it in the projects tab on the left. Notice here you got closing applications here. My output window, there's closing applications. That's how you're able to see these two are now connected. So inside closing all applications, we need to create a new XAML file. We need to have System One log off. So in our System 1 folder, I'm going to minimize my framework folder and do a right click on System 1 folder and say add a new sequence here. Again, System 1 underscore, in this case I want to call this one log off. What does this XAML file do? Its sole purpose is to log off the System 1 web page. Again, the location, since we did the right click on System 1, should already be set. Nothing need changed there. Notice in this case, I'm in main. I've already gone into close all applications. If I hit create here, again, it brings us to the blank file that I personally don't care for. I want to make sure that file gets invoked. So going back to close all applications, if I expand out System 1 and I bring in the log off XAML file here underneath closing all applications, I want to ensure that this code executes the next time the automation runs. So now that it's invoked, it will execute whatever I build here. Another common practice to get into here is to bring in an attached browser activity. So similar to the open browser, notice we don't need to open the browser, it's already open, in our case already logged in. We now need to go through the process of clicking the log out button and then subsequently closing the web browser itself, bringing it back to the same state it was in before we began automating. That's our goal here. So you heard me mention attached browser activity. So back on the activities tab, there is an attached browser activity. If I bring that across, indicate browser on screen. If I do this, you'll notice it highlights the entire web browser here. And this is good. It's talking about simply trying to attach to that actual browser page. It's important here though that you do not click up top here in the top part of the web browser. Some of the older versions of Studio actually allow you to click in this top part of the web browser. Make sure it's only in the actual browser page below. Anywhere, it does not matter where. Notice it's all the same gray. Simply click, and you'll see it shows up talking about the Acme System 1. It's just kind of a little screenshot. If we look at our selector here, this is going to be a case where we want to make this a bit more generic. This is very explicitly talking about, in this case, if I look at my title bar, Acme System 1, the dashboard page. I want to be able to potentially or theoretically log out from any page on the Acme System 1 web page. So I'm wanting to make an assumption that it's always safe to talk about taking it all the way down to Acme System. I probably could take it all the way down to Acme, but I'm going to put a wildcard here. Get rid of all the text. Now it's just Acme System star. This says the title of the web page, as long as it's Acme System anything, I don't care what's after it, this should be a valid selector. Any of the any of the pages in the web page. Go ahead and validate. It shows green. I want to go ahead and hit OK here. What we first are going to do, as you heard me say just a moment ago, we want to actually be able to hit the log out button, actually log ourselves out of the website. So to do that, let's first start with a log message here. Again, the eyes to which we can see UiPath. What is it doing? It's actually going to be clicking the log out button as an informational message. Now we can bring in our click activity. Notice element mouse click, bring it in, indicate element inside browser. In this case, we want to click the log out in the top right corner. This time we should not have a major issue with the selector like we had before. This one looks a lot better than what we had earlier. I want to maybe clean this one up just a little bit more and just say it's part of the nav bar. So I want to put a star here. Again, not required. This probably will work fine across all pages, but just to make sure it's generic enough. The A here is talking about it's an anchor tag from an HTML point of view, which implies it's a clickable link on the web page. In this case, the logout button is nice and generic. Notice this here, this is inherited from the attached browser, so we can't make changes directly here. You have to go back to that selector we did just a moment ago in order to tweak that. We hit validate here, everything should be good. Hit highlight, it's still up there, so this looks like a really awesome selector. Let's make sure that the web page is successfully loaded before we attempt to click the icon. And then the last thing we want to do is close the actual browser tab. So let's bring in another log message activity. Simply say here, informational, in this case, closing, Acme 1, or was it, let's be more specific, System 1 website, i.e. browser tab. Informational message. There is, and just so you can see this, all the different browser type activities that are there. If I type in browser, these are all the things we can do with a web browser. In this case, the one I'm really interested in here is it closes a browser page. So if I bring this activity in, you'll notice there's no properties to be set, but this will in effect close that page. So if I go back to the web browser, notice here if I just simply hover over the X that says close tab, that's the exact action that this particular behavior takes. Notice I have no arguments coming in. I have no variables. It's just purely looking at the web page, clicking the log out, and subsequently closing the tab to log off the website. If I save this file, if I go back to main, quickly here, manually log out one more time. Hopefully this will be one of the last times we need to do it. If we fail to log out, it's going to error when you attempt to log back in because it won't see the username and password. You can force it to log out, and see the bot take over. But just to make sure we don't get into that situation, go ahead and hit log out. You can close the browser, otherwise a kill task will do it. Now we're back to Studio, go to main and hit play on debug file. And now you should see UiPath log into the web page and then very quickly log itself right back, actually clicking the log out button and then closing the web browser back down. So there's username and password. It logs in. It should quickly go out and hit log out up top, take you back to the login screen and close the browser. You'll notice at this point we are successfully logged out of the web browser, and UiPath Studio is back in sitting in front of us again. If I go to the output window again, you see clicking out the log out button, clicking out the IE browser tab. If I actually pull Internet Explorer back up here really quick, if I go to the Acme web page, you'll notice I should not be logged in. That means that the log out activity indeed performed exactly as was intended. So our login and log out logic is successfully completed. Now I can begin working on the actual processing logic now that our logging and logging out logic is working as designed and intended. So in order to do this, I want to go ahead and go back up to our main workflow at the very high level here. So at this point, we've successfully logged ourselves into the application, in this case, the System 1 website, and have successfully logged ourselves out. So the third and final spot in which we need to add logic, in this case for our dispatcher bot, is inside of the process transaction state. This is the heart of any of our automations. The core logic for either dispatcher or performer bot will always live inside of the process transaction state. This is what, in this case, identifies records to be processed, the dispatcher bot, and obviously executing the work that needs to be manually, that the manual work of times past, this is where the automation logic would reside, is inside of process transaction as we speak to a performer bot. So go ahead and open up, double click on the process transaction state, and you'll notice the third and final XAML file of the framework that is highly relevant and important to us is the process.xaml. It's important enough that it actually lives right next to main in our overall project. Recall our other files within framework, there's close all applications to close our applications down, and init all applications to turn those applications on, live inside the framework folder. But these would be the other two, highly important XAML files. So really, if you think about it, with what we've talked about to this point, those three XAML files are the ones that 95, if not 98% of all your logic, will always reside in. It's your logic, to start up applications init, close those applications as we did inside of close all applications, and then our third and final one, again, it's the heart and soul of your automation. This is where the core logic resides that drives your automation to perform the way you ultimately design as intended. So with that in mind, I want to close our two tabs from our log off logic and closing all applications. We're done. We've tested that. That logic seems to be working as intended. Let's now go into the process.xaml here and open this workflow. You'll notice in our output window, staying with our cadence that we've been going on from a checklist point of view, this logic here actually lives, it's not quite as clearly noticeable here, but you'll notice it's talking about, there's our login, then it says transaction successful. That's actually coming out of the fact that we had no errors or exceptions thrown inside a process because there's no code here yet. This is kind of our indication to start adding code to process when you see this line here with the way we've been running it. And obviously closing all applications, that's where we were at just a moment ago when we were logging out of the application. So process, this is where you have to really start thinking like a bot, is how I try to get people to think about this. So this notion here, and this is somewhat misleading in the sense that we're already logged back out. So to try to bring an example to this, obviously we're not going to get into process. No, I take that back. We should be able to set a breakpoint right here, toggle breakpoint on our process here. And if you run your automation from main, we should hit that breakpoint. I started thinking about the performer bot. Obviously, if there were no records here, we would not get down to the process, but in this case, we're not getting any records. So it's guaranteed we should get to this point. So that breakpoint should execute. So here the website comes up. There's the password, the username, it logs in, and we should hit the breakpoint real quick after that. And there we are, breakpoint is set. So notice it's waiting to execute process. So this is that notion of what I was describing a minute ago. Start thinking like what a bot would think. We have to teach the bot each and every single step along the way of everything that it needs to do. It will always do nothing more and nothing less. It explicitly follows the directions that you provide it. So we need to be able to be very specific as to what we want the bot to do. In this particular case, I'm going to actually stop the bot here. I want to clear this breakpoint. The reason I'm stopping the bot here is now we're at a point we need to begin adding code. So I'm going to clear this breakpoint using the little breakpoint tab option here at the bottom. Clear that breakpoint, otherwise you got to toggle back and forth a couple times. So at this rate, we're ready to start adding code, and it walks you right through, invokes steps of the process. What do we need to do? So right now, the bot got us to here. It brought us to this very page. We recall from our original conversation with the project requirements, we need to get to the work items page so we can actually see the WI5 and open status records. So us as a human, if we were doing this, we would click on the work items page here, and it would take us to the work items page. Again, this is where we can begin extracting data and grabbing the WI5 open status records here. Notice the URL though, we actually can steal and leverage the URL up top here to get to the work items page specifically. So what we're going to do is have the bot actually from here. So if we go back to the home page, we're actually going to have the bot change the web address specifically to there and hit enter, and you notice it takes us to the work items page. So we need to create a new XAML file. This is again thinking like about what do you want the bot to do, and it's what we just demonstrated. We want to have the bot change the URL website to this exact path here. So new XAML file, that implies, think of XAML files as being small, very explicit, functioning tasks that need to be done, typically down to a single page. It's where you can test single functionality out, the very specific type level. So with that said, back to Studio. We're going to obviously put our new XAML file right inside of process here, and it's going to navigate us to the work items page. So right click on system1 folder, say add new sequence. In this case, follow our same logic, system1 underscore, and I'm going to simply call this one navigate to. We're going to make sure, if I can spell, navigate to. We we want this to be as, a reusable-ish type component is the other thing you got to think about with these files. Can we repurpose them later on down the road? And I'll give you a hint and tip when we get to our Performer bot. We'll be able to reuse this one. Obviously, our login, logout logic we will be as well. But then when we get into our generate yearly report project, we'll also be able to repurpose some of these same XAML files as well. So reusability is another important aspect that you want to bring into play when you go to build these individual XAML files. So specific enough functionality that can be repurposed and reused, as well as easily tested. That's kind of your goal as to when you want to create a new XAML file. All right, the path should be set from before. System 1, since we did the right click there, so no change there. System 1 underscore navigate to and create. Here's our usual. It opens it up, ready for us to build. Let's make sure we invoke it first by going back to process and invoking navigate to. And inside of navigate to, as we've done before, we need a attached browser activity. Navigate on the screen. And in this case, it really doesn't matter what page we're on, we're going to have to make this dynamic as well. So if you're on the home page, that's fine. If you're on the work items page, that'll work the same as well. So go ahead and click anywhere in the web page. This notion of making the dynamic selector, or making the selector more dynamic, go into edit selector here, and like we did on the logging out logic, allow us to navigate to any web page anywhere inside the Acme system star, any page that starts with Acme system, be able to use this logic accordingly. In this case, I want to bring a log message in to say where are we going. And if I bring an informational message here, I'll say system 1 navigate to, clean this up a bit. System 1 navigate to, and then in this case, we need a variable. I don't have a variable yet. Technically, I need an argument. Where do we want to go? In this case, I'm going to create a new argument called in URL. What's the web address that you need to be able to go to? And in this case, I create a new argument called in URL. And then I go in to do a in URL here. It's going to take whatever website address I pass in here, and it's going to send it into my log message right here. So if I hit save here, and if I go back to process, you'll notice it's now glowing orange. Where do I want to navigate the website to? So in this case, in URL value, this needs to be something I need to be able to pull in from the config file. So if I open up config, obviously we already have the base URL in here. So we're already kind of a step in the right direction. We already have this website here. We need a new system 1 URL. In this case, we'll call this work item path. And if you look at the web address, I want to pull in the whole thing just so we can see it. Copy. And if I paste it, I could do this. I could leave it right here. But one thing that I don't like about this is now I've got the same value here that I have up here. I actually can bring these two values together. And this is more of what I'm trying to get at. Notice the slash here is already in the item up here. So I can technically delete this part out. I want to go ahead and bring the final slash in here. Notice in the URL, or actually, yeah, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and leave. This is optional, but I want to go ahead and kind of follow suit. I want to leave my slash here for now. This will be the URL path to get to the work items page on system 1 website. So at this rate, what I want to do is I've got to obviously pull this value in and then pull this value in and concatenate these two to build that full string being the actual web address that we want up here. So to be able to demonstrate this, I go back to here, I'm going to save this. Obviously, I need these two values. So back to Studio. Notice in my arguments, what is the web page address that I want to go to? And another thing that we haven't talked about inside here real fast is notice in my process, I have my config. In this case, with our dispatcher bot, the in transaction item value here isn't going to have a whole lot of merit or purpose at this point. But when we get to our performer bot, this is actually the variable in which contains the data that is coming back to us from the orchestrator queue. So hold that other variable in mind as we move forward. But for this particular process, in config, obviously is going to allow us to grab each of these two values and build the actual URL that we're trying to navigate to. So with that said, if I go back into Studio, into my arguments, the URL that I want to build is going to be in_config. I'm just going to simply build this out this way for a minute, and then in_config again. And toString. I want to have two of these side by side, but specifically the first part of the string is this. So taking this key, if I copy that value, paste that value back into here, and then on the other side, take the key for the second part of the URL here and paste this into the second part over on this side. So make it a bit more visible. There's my in config. It's taking the URL, system1 URL that we already had before, and we created this new one, system1_work item path, that's going to concatenate those two together, essentially making this very string right here. So I'll pause here for just a second so you can see that one last time. It's just taking in config, concatenating it back again. The important takeaway here is if you're concatenating these two strings is make sure your slashes line up correctly. You don't want two slashes necessarily here. So you got a slash here. You don't need the leading slash here, work items. This last one we could leave off. I'll give you a hint when we get to the performer bot later. This will actually be an important slash that we'll want to be able to reference. So really just trying to stay uniform with our approach that the ending slash always goes with the the first value that we're typing in. So I'm going to save my config, close that. This is good to go. If I go back into the Navigate to, obviously we should see the URL typed here. If we go back and look at our activities one last time, well, browser is already here. So from before, our browser, notice all the activities here. Check out, there's one in here called Navigate to, navigate the browser to a given URL. Sounds pretty relevant for what we're trying to do, right? So in_ take our same text here, in_ URL. What's the web page that we want to navigate the system1 website to? That's all that little activity does. So at this rate, if I save my project, obviously save here. And by the way, when you run these, it'll automatically save all those, but it's just kind of a good second practice to get into. If I play my automation, run my automation here in debug mode, I should see IE close again. Actually, I'm logged into the web page, so the one error that I was talking about a moment ago, if we forget to close, watch what happens when the browser reopens. The site's going to already be logged in. I'm going to cheat real quick and hit log out. Now you see the bot take over. If we wanted to get really in depth and detail with our logging in logic, there we go. Our work items page loaded and automation has terminated. Now notice this rate, my web browser is closed because I did the full execution, but I did notice that the web page successfully went to the work items page. It was very brief, and then it logged itself back out and closed. The thing I was getting ready to say about the logging in logic and that error that we experienced right there, we could go back in and invest a lot more time into trying to error handle and process that to where if it's already logged in, check to see is it the right user, etc. The only reason I've not done that in this particular scenario here is I didn't want to totally lose focus on the logging in logic and take away from the core aspect of what it is we're trying to solve for here. But given a more robust and production grade automation application, those are exactly situations and scenarios that you will want to account for and accommodate for as you're building your automation to ensure that it performs exactly the way it's designed and intended. So at that rate, Navigate 2 is done. So let me go back to Studio here, or back to IE, since closed because I ran the automation outright. So open up Internet Explorer again. Have to log ourselves back in. I could cheat. You know what? No, let's do this. I'm going to cheat the bot again. Cancel that idea of opening up the web browser. Set another breakpoint like we did a moment ago. Toggle breakpoint. Set it right here. And right here was right as we're getting ready to navigate to. Go ahead and hit run here, hit play, on our debug. Let the bot do the work. I was going to manually log myself back in, but why do that when the bot's already got the capability of doing it for me? In this case, the log out logic would have done the logging out, so here it's logging in without needing to manually do the log out. And we should be to the breakpoint right here. And we are. It's getting ready to do the navigate to, which we saw worked a moment ago. So I'm going to stop here for a minute and kind of do what the bot would do here. It would take us to the work items page. So this is the very page that the bot would be at this moment in time, given the fact this step here actually executed. So let's clear this breakpoint here one more time. And we're ready to create our next XAML file. We're ready to actually begin extracting out all the work items off of our list here. There's actually an activity that will grab all of the work items. Obviously, this idea of doing the WI5 records, let's hold that thought for a minute. First, let's get the data, and then we'll work on the logic of parsing the data back down. We'll actually do that in 2 different steps. One will extract, the other one we will kind of do 2 things. We'll take the data that's only WI5 and open status, and at the same time, once we identify those records, subsequently load those into our orchestrator queue. So with that said, make sure you are currently manually navigated to the work items page. Obviously, this is where the bot, again, thinking like a bot, as I heard me say a minute ago, this is where the bot would be right now. So if you, the human, were doing this, what would you do? You would begin walking through each of these pages, page at a time, identifying all those WI5 open records. In this case, let's just scrape the data. Obviously, you'd have to look through all these manually yourself, going through each one. We need to make sure the bot has all the data available to it. So with that said, we go into the extract work items process here. So close navigate to, back to process tab, go back to project, and we need to create another new XAML file. In this case, new sequence, right click at system 1, add new sequence. In this case, staying with our same naming convention, system1 underscore. We'll say extract work items, taking all the work items off the page. At this rate, system1 folder is already there, so we don't need to do anything crazy. And here goes our usual. Once you hit create, it gives me the blank file. I want to make sure that file gets executed. So I bring the extract all work items across. And now I'm ready to begin extracting the work items off the page. Go ahead and save here, extract work items on this side. This will be the easiest XAML file we build all day because we're actually going to leverage a process, or what you call a wizard, that UiPath has already engineered for us, that allows us to scrape the data off of the web page. And in order to do that, go ahead and make sure you're in your new extract work items XAML file. Again, making sure you already invoked it over on your process underneath navigate to. So it's important that these are in this very specific order. Navigate to first, and then extract work items next. So we get to the work items detail, or the work items listing page, and then we can actually extract the data. You can't transpose these two. Very specific that the order of these is exact. So system1 extract work items. You'll notice there is an option here at the top that's called data scraping. Data scraping is a little wizard that pops up. Notice it even says extract wizard. And as you read through this, it says open your browser. We already did. We're on the work items page, or document other applications. The key here is the data has to be in a formal structured type table. And this would be a formal HTML table that you're seeing underneath the wizard here. And it says press the next in this dialog to hover the mouse over one of the data source fields and then click into that field. So go ahead and hit next. You'll notice the UiPath goes into kind of its UI, UI Explorer mode, where you can actually see the eyes in which UiPath is able to see the user interface. Important thing to note here, do not click on any of the headers up here. It wants to know where the detailed data information is at. You can click on any of these values. It really does not matter as long as you're not grabbing any of the header details along here. I've kind of gotten into customary practice of just grabbing the top left value, but it technically does not matter. You can grab any of the raw data element items in here with the exception of the headers. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on this top left corner work item ID. Again, your numbers are going to be different from mine depending on the data loaded when you generated the new work item details when you reset your test data on the Acme page. So but the structure of the content is going to be the same. So it's just a matter of clicking here. It's going to say you selected a table cell. Would you like to extract the data from the whole table? So they're talking this whole table right here. Absolutely, I do. I need you to bring everything back for me. So go ahead and say yes here. And when you do that, notice it gives you kind of a little data preview here. It's letting you see the actual data here. So UiPath has run their little wizard, and they've extracted this table into this. Really, if you look at it, it's a data table. In this case, 377 matches, 428 being the bottom one, 428 bottom one. Pick on a couple of the dates over here, 531 top record, 9/4, 2020 for the bottom records. So at that rate, the only other really particular thing to note here, maximum number of results, I want to make sure it brings me back everything, so I want to specify as 0. But if you had a lot of data, you've got a way to ensure that it maxes out at a certain point if necessary or needed. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say 0. Give me all the data that's available and click finish. Then it asks you another question as part of the wizard. It says, is the data spanning multiple pages? And in this case, yes, it is. We know that it is from the work we did on selectors earlier on. So identify the element that navigates to the next page. It could be a next button or an arrow, not just the page number. It says yes to indicate it. So this is actually talking about use the actual next button. So recall with our dynamic selectors, we use this to identify if we were on the last page. Obviously, Studio, as part of this wizard, is going to leverage this button as well. Obviously, it's probably going to be clicking it to take it to each next page until this icon is no longer found. So go ahead and click on the greater than icon here. And you'll notice magically it started to build all these activities. It says extract structured data table here. And you'll notice the output here is going into a new variable called extract data table. Recall a moment ago too, I also said we need to be able to send the results from the extracted data back to process so we can create another new XAML file. And that new XAML file is going to be responsible for identifying the WI5 and OpenStash records, but more importantly, adding those records into the orchestrator queue. So with that said, I don't want it to be a variable in this case. I actually want it to be an argument. And this argument right here needs to be called out. We're sending this out of extract work items back to process. So this needs to be out DT or data table work items. Important, important, important. Make sure your direction here goes to out. We're sending this data table out and back to process in this case. And the argument type is also extremely important. It's coming to us in the form of a data table. If I look back at the variables, just so you can see it, there's the extract data table as a data table here. What I want to do is actually delete this variable. I want to reuse the other one now. So when I delete, I want to get an error. That's fine. If I look at it, it's complaining that it has not been declared. That was automatically declared as part of the wizard. But in this case, if I double click here and change DT, in this case, out underscore DT work items, my error now goes away. So now the final data table from the extract goes into our argument now. of out DT work items, which we defined right here. Again, make sure your direction on this guy is out and your argument type is a data table. And that's really all this file does. If we hit save here and then go back to process, you'll notice we got a complaint here. In this case, we declared that new argument as an out. We need to be able to catch and hold the output from this argument in process now. So in this case, we don't have a data table yet, so I'm going to call this one DT underscore work items. I did a control K. That's how we got the set variable or declare new variable, DT underscore work items. Now if I hit OK here, you notice the little blue box shows up. It's because it hasn't officially been declared yet. As soon as I hit OK again, you'll notice DT work item shows up here. If I peer back in, my arguments are good. So we have successfully navigated to, we have extracted all the data. Actually, one other little thing here, we probably should put another log message in here so we know where the bot is at. Close out, log messages right here. Bring this right above the data scraping and put an informational message that simply says begin data scrape extract of work items. Again, just something meaningful as to what this is ultimately doing. Scraping the data, we're extracting all the work items. In this XAML file, it's going to be a bit tricky. I could put this is kind of a weird thing to do, but I could put a little right line down here instead of breakpoint here. Notice I'm doing this outside of the attached browser all the way down below. Set a breakpoint on it. If I play this single file, make sure you are on first page of work items. Obviously, if you are and you click it, we'll call our dynamic selector. Go ahead and get back in. If I play or run in debug mode this XAML file here with this right line, just putting in quotes, I don't need it to actually display. I'm cheating it just so I get a good breakpoint here right when this is done, just to see if the data is there. So I want to run this single file. Notice I did not go back to main. I only played this single file. I'm able to test out, does the logic here work? So it should be right now walking through extracting that data off of the web page. It did not bring the web page to the foreground, but it mainly brought it through here real quick. You can see it's clicking through. I should hit the breakpoint here in just a second. Takes a little bit here for it to build that data table for us. So there's a bit of a pause here, which is normal. It should hit the breakpoint here in a minute. We should then be able to borrow the locals window to just kind of do a quick peer in and see if the data actually did extract from our wizards. There's the breakpoint. If I expand this out, give us some real estate here so we can see into the view. There's my new arguments, out DT work items. Remember, that is what we used. Right here is the output from the extract. I should have all the data sitting in here from before. There's the raw view. If I expand this out a bit, you can see a copy of the data right here. There's all the records. There's the completed one, another open status record. So you can see it successfully has extracted all the records across all of the pages. Again, this is found inside the locals window. Notice we're still technically executing here. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop here. I mainly did that just to validate, is this XAML file performing the way we designed or intended? So I'm going to delete this entire right line. This was there just so I could get that breakpoint. Test the file. Everything looks good inside of here, so I'm going to consider the extract work item XAML file complete. So our last and final activity obviously warrants a new XAML file here. Mind you, here we're passing the arguments back out. So right here, DT work items would have that same view we had. But we are now at the point we need to create our last XAML file that's going to ultimately load the data into the work item queue. So our last one, do a right click on system1, say new sequence here, and say system1 underscore load. I'll say WI work item underscore to QUEUE and click create. And it's our usual process. It gives me the blank file, but I want to make sure this file is invoked. So I jump back to process again. Again, order is important here. We're navigating the work items page. We're extracting the data, and now we're going to load the data from queue. It has to be in this very explicit order here. If I open up, let's go ahead and save here my little change to the process. Open up the work item, or open up the XAML file. At this rate, we need to begin filtering out the data. We only want to keep the WI5 and open status records. There is an activity. If I come in here to data table, project tab again, come back to activities tab and type in data table. These are all the things we can do with a data table. One of them being filter, and notice that if you hover over filter, it says the activity can keep or delete rows or columns according to logical conditions specified in the wizard. That's exactly what we want to do. So if I bring this activity in and go into the filter wizard here, notice it's going to say what data table, and this is something that we have not defined yet, and we'll need to ensure that we do. And in this particular case here, we need to be able to look at that work items data table that we had a moment ago. So we need to bring that into the XAML file, which implies we need a new argument right here. So in DT work items, it's inbound this time. We're bringing the data from process into the load to queue. And again, the type here is of data table. So in DT work items is inbound data table. If we hit save here, go back to process, hopefully you're already expecting this. But here's where all of a sudden it's saying we've got mismatched arguments here. We need to be able to import our argument right here. In this case, we know our variable inside process is DT underscore work item. So import arguments, we want to take this here and send it into DT work item. So the value here becomes DT underscore work items. Take this data table, which was the one that came out of extract work items. That's how that got populated. And take that, put it in as a value, and send it into, in this case, load work items to queue, the in DT work items into here, into load work items to queue. Say, okay, it's happy here. Save our little change there. When we come back here, now we've got this available. It's wanting to know what data table do we want to look at. So in underscore DT work items becomes the input. The output on the other side, we can still specify the same one. This is actually, just so you're aware, we can do a control K here. We can create another variable. If we created a new variable there, which I'm not going to do, you can preserve the old data table and create a new one right here on the fly. It's more or less want to create a copy of the current data table here, but after things have been filtered out or cleaned up. In this case, I don't really care about preserving the data, so I'm going to use the output to be the same. It's going to take the current one, run some logic against it, and save it right back to itself in the same spot. Overwriting, not preserving any of the old data. So the only thing left in here, in this case with what we'll be done with, is the WI5 open status records. But while we're here, quickly to point it out, notice Filter Wizard's got the ability to filter rows or columns. So being able to pull, either keeping or removing certain columns from the overall data table. It's kind of an easy way to do a quick clean, if you will, to remove certain columns or keep certain columns from the data table that you've passed in. Or on the other side, this filter rows, where we can say, do you want to keep the records that have been identified? Or do we want to remove those, keeping all the other records that aren't in the match? So in this case, we want to keep records. We only want to keep the ones that are of WI5 and open status. If we would have gone back to where we set the breakpoint, where we put us on the table, just to save us a bit of time here, the column names for our data table actually match the column names from the data that was extracted. So these actually become the column names in our data table that we're going to be filtering. So in this case, we want to mess around with type and status, and obviously pay attention to the case sensitivity and no spacing, or if there were spaces, make sure you pay attention to the spacing that is here. Obviously a lack thereof here. But no, that's what I'm trying to get at here, column name. So in this case, in double quotes, type in type, and this is all the different ways you can evaluate this particular data point that's in column. In this case, we want it to be equal to, in this case, WI5. And then if you hit the little plus out here, you can then also say status in quotes. And we want this one to also be equal to, but again, just so you're aware, look at all these other properties or options. Again, depending on what it is you're trying to filter, one of these may be very specific to your automation needs. So in this case, in quotes, open. So this will ensure that all the records that are kept from this data table is where the column of type equals WI5, and notice the and condition here, status equals open. This is an important little thing to pay attention to. Notice it's just a little toggle switch here. If we said or, it's going to bring back all the records that are of WI5, or if the status equals to open. So if we look at the data here, I'll go back to page 1 here for a moment. It's going to bring back every status that's open, so all these records regardless. So I'd have the WI1s, 2s, 3s, and so on. But then I would also bring this record back, which is nice, except the argument is we don't want it if it's marked completed. But it's WI5. But in this case, since it's WI5, it would come back, or if it's open. So that's where we need to pay really close attention to this. We want to make sure in our case it's and. It needs to be both, not one or the other. Both scenarios have to apply. So that's how the filter data table works. It specifies the data table. Where do you want to save it to? In this case, replacing same name. Otherwise, you could create a new one on the fly here. Keep, in our case, the rows that have type WI5, the column name, and the column status here of open. So we hit OK here. This is also another awesome time for a couple log messages here. I want to put one below and above the filter wizard here. Let both these be informational as well. Simply say here, right above, say total records before filter. And in this case, concatenate and say in DT work items dot rows dot count. And then we have to convert that to a string because that's coming back to us in the form of a number. This is going to tell us how many records there are in the work items. Then we filter it on the opposite side. I would copy that value, paste it back in, and say here after filter. So just so you can see it here again for a moment. Both these message box or log messages are exactly the same with the exception of changing the word before to after and vice versa. Again, allowing us to see how many records were in before the filter, how many records are there after the filter. Let's go ahead and cancel there. And the last thing we need to do now, we have all the WI5 open status records in our data table here in our output. Notice DT work items. We can now begin adding those records to our orchestrator queue. So with that in mind, we need to, from an activity perspective, QUE, you'll notice there's a couple options here. This is the one that we will end up using. Add item to queue, but I'd want to be transparent and show everybody this bulk add items to queue. So don't follow me on this step here. I want to bring this in just so you're aware of what its capability is. You notice bulk add items to queue. It wants to know what data table are we wanting to import. In this case, if we were doing it, we could say in DT work items to take the entire data table and pass it into whatever queue name it is that we ultimately are seeking. and it's got the ability to do some extra results, you know, being able to output a new data table, etc. You know, kind of status update. The problem with this is you don't have a whole lot of control over the data that's going into your individual queue. You know, and being able to set priorities, deadlines, importance, etc. Along those lines, you lose that capability, you know, natively and inherently this way. So that's where, you know, if you just need to get the data straight to your queue, you don't really care how it gets there, and you don't care about all the, you know, having a, you know, potentially excess data out there. This is an excellent option to be able to quickly add items to a queue. But again, the reason I pull this in here just to demonstrate you don't have a lot of, you know, inherent control here. So in this case, I don't want to use the bulk here. I want to actually use the add queue item here. I bring this activity, and you'll notice there are a lot more details here. There's your deadlines, postponed priorities, you know, your importance status here. But yet again, what queue do you want to add them to? When we get to this item information, this is where we actually add the item, you know, particular that we want to add into the, you know, what data do we want to ultimately add to the orchestrator queue itself. So if we're going to do this activity, this implies that we need to be able to walk through each record, one record at a time. So hopefully this implies the need for a for each row activity here. So if I bring this in, I'll call it for each row as opposed to for each. For each row is specific to a data table. And I could have brought that in. Either way, I'm bringing this in. Important though that it shows up after the filter data table wizard here. Then I want to bring the add queue items and place it into the body of my loop. But for each row, what data table do we want to loop through? We only have the one to deal with right here. So in DT work items, obviously we're talking about each row. And then when we get into adding the queue items here, we probably should put a log message here as well. Would not be a bad practice. Simply to say something along, make it informational, something along the lines here to say adding record to QUE. In this case, concatenate it in with, let's see here, row dot item. In this case, WIID is the value and toString. So everybody can see this. Adding record to queue, we're going to add this work item ID to the queue. So actually this becomes an item that we can save here. And actually you could just say, it's kind of redundant to type an item. You could simply say row work items to string here. This would accomplish the same thing. The item is specifically talking about the column name. So we can do that. Notice I copied that row WIID. I want to paste this into a couple different spots. The first one I want to paste it into is the reference column. Recall this is the value inside of Orchestrator, or the column inside Orchestrator that lets us easily see the work item ID when we're actually in the queue itself. In this case, we're not going to worry about changing any of the priority here, setting dates or deadlines. We'll leave everything as normal. The item information is the other important spot that we need to do. This again becomes a spot in which we specify the value that actually gets saved in Orchestrator queue. So again, using the same value here, the row work item ID, this is talking about, again, the actual column name from our data table. You know, here's where the WIID is coming from. We just simply want to store the work item ID numbers here. That's all we're doing, saving those values. So when we get back into Orchestrator or into Studio, this can be any value that we want over here. In this case, work item ID is a descriptive value for the actual ID. This becomes the value inside of Orchestrator, or the key, I should say, for the record inside Orchestrator. This is obviously being the value that's saved associated to that particular key for each record in the Orchestrator queue. So we say, okay, here, the one thing, it looks like nothing's happened. It's still there. We didn't lose it. If you want, go ahead and save your work here. It's fine. Add item to queue. The one thing we're missing right now is what queue do you want to add the data to? And if you think about it here, we have not yet specified that. in here. We don't have a queue name argument in here yet, so we need to create another new argument real quick and say underscore QUE. What's the queue name? Recall this lives inside of config. So our queue name here, it's a string. If I hover over it, it says queue name is string. In this case, in underscore, nope, grabbed the wrong one here. In underscore queue name. Notice I've got no errors now. The one thing that I have to do though, if I save here and go back to process, guess what? He's complaining again. If I look inside of queue name, in underscore config is there, but notice I don't remember the name of the key to getting the queue name. So quickly leave it as a template there. Go back to your config file. And then recall we already updated it. Acme1 is the queue name. So in this case, I need the key. So I copy the queue name here. Again, just so everybody can see what we're talking about really quick. If I go back to cloud.uipath.com, looks like it's still got me logged in, but if you need to log in, go ahead and use your credentials. Again, go to default tenant. And again, what it's trying to get to here, if I look at my queues, it's trying to get to this value here. So inside of my config, you'll notice Acme1, this value here is talking about this being the queue name inside of Orchestrator. So to get that key out, or that value out, I need this particular key right here, Orchestrator queue name. I'm gonna close that down. Yes, go ahead and save. I don't think I made any changes there, but just in case. And then in this case, inside my arguments for load item to queue now, you see there's the queue name. We already started doing it. I just need to put in the queue name, Orchestrator queue name property right there. And this will ensure that that Acme1 gets passed into queue name here. So when I get into my file here, add items to queue, it will then populate that queue name right here. And I should be at a point that this file should be completed. So I'm gonna go ahead and save here, save process. I think we're at a point we can actually try to run our automation outright. So right now you'll notice I've got no items in queue right now. Everything is blank. So I want to go ahead and manually log out. If you have Acme1 open, go ahead and hit log out here. I'm going to go ahead and close the web browser. It's going to do it anyways for me. We're at a point, let's go ahead and run our bot and see what type of results we get. So from main, go ahead and hit play and run here. Debug our file and see how things perform. So we should see here the data, username and password again, successfully logs in. Then it should navigate to the work items page, which it does. Now you see it actually navigating through. So what we built in the wizard a moment ago, it's stepping its way through each individual page, extracting each table, and subsequently going to build a really a concatenated view of all the pages in the one single data table for us. That's where this little pause right here comes into play. So a bit of a delay here, and again, this is purely as it's trying to load the data table. Notice right now I'm not paying a lot of attention to the fact I got that other status already completed. We're ultimately going to reset all the test data before we do a final run. Right now we're just in development mode, so the details aren't as important at this very moment in time. So looks like we added a successful run here. We added, in this case, in my particular case, these 10 items were added to the queue. Tell me I had 78 before. Remember, this was that filter logic we did a minute ago. So we got down to just 10 items that are in my case. Your numbers are going to be different depending on the data that's loaded on your Acting 1 page, but in this case, mine got narrowed down to just 10 records. Here's the 10 actually getting added to the queue and our for each row loop. More importantly, though, did these records actually make it to the orchestrator queue or not? So that's where I'm going to open Explorer back up. I should see 10 records in my orchestrator queue. So moment of truth, if I go to cloud.uipath.com, and if I pull up my orchestrator queue again, default tenant, and go to my queues once I get logged in here, I should see, there you go, remaining 10 items. Those 10 items have been added. If I view the transactions, if I spend a little bit of time going back and forth through these, I should see these 10 here in the reference column aligned to the 10 items that I actually see in here. So 369 and 370 at the top and bottom. I'm going to assume there's 369 and 370 on top and bottom there. So it looks like the data has successfully loaded. So this is implying that my dispatcher bot is indeed functioning correctly and as intended. So I'm at a point now, I'm ready to begin working on the Performer bot. So this officially concludes the demonstration as it pertains to the dispatcher bot for the Generate Client Security Hash project.